Okay, good. You see my screen and you hear me, right?
Yes, yes, both okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this opportunity to share some of my research and my thoughts with you all. And what I will be talking about definitely picks up on a lot of issues that have already come up in the discussion today as well as yesterday. So I'll be speaking about borders and debordering in the 21st century, transforming policies of exclusion to policies of inclusion. So the sorts of issues that I want to focus on in particular is the fact that despite the globalization that we have experienced, especially since the 1990s, we actually are experiencing a new age of walls. And I'll go into details about this new age of walls. And this is happening at the same time as we are having more and more populations on the move. So this is, of course, a huge tension, a huge challenge, the fact that we increasingly have hard borders, but we have populations on the move because of all sorts of different reasons, ranging from economic inequality to political instability, as well as increasingly due to climate change. Then lastly, I want to propose that we should think about a new economic paradigm based on softer and more porous borders and based also on transnational cooperation and a new evidence-based public discourse about migration. Those are basically the three policy proposals that were in my contribution, and I will now speak to each one of those in turn. So, but first of all, I want to go back in history a little bit, and I think most of us are probably old enough that we have experienced the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. That was a period of hope, a period of a sense that we now are living in a globalized world with open borders and a free flow of movements across borders, as well as free flow of information. And the notion was that the ideologically divided world that we had been living in up until 1989 finally has shifted into a much more open world with open borders. But that hope turned out to be misguided, because actually, if you look at what happened post 1989, we see a new age of walls. Those are physical, material, but also bureaucratic walls. The walls have been built across the globe, whether in Africa, the United States, of course, with Mexico, Europe or Asia. We've seen increasingly these sorts of strategies of division going up all over the place. And the assumption by policymakers tends to be, well, they create security, they curb terrorism, or they minimize ethnic violence. Whether this is true or not, this is a long discussion, but this, of course, is the way these proposed walls are always being presented to the public. The reasons for them being built are presented in those terms. Now, Saskia Sassen, who is a sociologist at Columbia University, explains that these walls, which we often refer to as new strategies of exclusion, as actually resulting from unequal economic development due to globalization that happened particularly after 1989. And various people in border studies have actually established that the best predictor of a border wall being built between two countries is the inequality, the economic inequality across the border between the two countries. So for instance, in the United States, we have a wall with Mexico, but we don't have a wall with Canada. Well, Canada, of course, is a much more economically stable country than Mexico. Then another aspect that we should be aware of is that these borders are soft for some people, sort of the privileged bourgeois citizen, but they're hard for others, the underprivileged people that have low resources. So it always depends who is traveling, and depending on that, borders can be harder or softer. So as you can see, these borders have only been proliferating over the last few years. And a colleague of mine actually who works in Montreal, Elisabeth Vallée, she makes it her project to count these walls that go up across the globe. And at this point, we have about 77 hard walls across the globe. And Trump even got excited about the research that was being done in Montreal, and actually quoted my colleague, claiming that these walls are all over the globe and that they work. And Elisabeth Vallée tweeted back and said, well, all my research shows they actually don't work. So he obviously saw the numbers thinking this would justify the Mexico-American wall, but didn't really read the small print that actually they don't work. So as you can see, there are lots of different walls in different parts of the world. You see images of the Arizona border wall. On the right-hand side at the bottom, you see the wall in the West Bank. This is a wall between Israel and Bethlehem, where I did a lot of my research. And it sort of exemplifies some of these mechanisms that are unfolding all over the globe. So here you have, again, images of the separation barrier between Israel and the West Bank. It consists of a wall as well as an elaborate fence system, and of course has a lot of checkpoints through which primarily Palestinians have to go through in order to go to Israel, if they even have the permission to go to Israel. And you have other sorts of closure mechanisms, which of course really inhibits the freedom of movement, and provides for a lot of spaces of tension. So what we find is that Palestinians and Israelis primarily meet each other at checkpoints, which of course are already points of tension. So the sort of the sort of cycle of conflict just gets even more intensified by the fact that it is these sorts of spaces where people meet. Then also here we have some images of the Mexican-American barrier between San Diego and Tijuana in Mexico, which is also a very interesting space to look at and experience. On the Mexican side, you can see it's very lively. There are lots of parties, beach parties going on. On the American side, it's very securitized. And there is something called a friendship circle and binational garden. As you can see, two of my colleagues are actually walking into that garden, which doesn't look very much like a garden. And then one of my other colleagues actually is speaking to someone on the Mexican side through this mesh, basically. So it's not exactly a nice space to be having to interact. And this is often where families from the American side and the Mexican side can meet. Well, meet is a bit of an overstatement. So now at the same time that we have these borders going up across the globe, we have more and more displaced people. And the numbers have increased dramatically since the 2000s. And by 2014, we had nearly 60 million people being displaced. And as I mentioned before, there are various economic and political reasons for that, as well as climate change that has contributed to the level of displacement that we have been experiencing. So here are just some statistics. As you can see, in 2017, 1 in every 110 people globally was being forcefully displaced worldwide. So those are huge numbers. This is a huge social problem, a challenge that we have to deal with. This is a problem that is not going away. And policymakers, at least under the Obama administration, were aware of the fact this problem is not going away. We have to come up with good solutions. And building walls has never yet been a good solution. And if we look at walls historically, we can also see that these walls have never worked to solve these sorts of social problems. So when we look at where these refugees and migrants end up, when we just listen to the media, of course, we tend to assume they all end up in the United States and Europe. But actually, statistically, the EU as well as the US don't rank amongst the 10 major refugee hosting countries, but rather it's places like Turkey, Lebanon, Pakistan that actually host a lot of refugees. And as you can see from this particular map, actually some of the poorest countries in the world, such as Burundi, are hosting more refugees than a lot of European countries. So at the same time, we have people crossing borders illegally because there are no good legal mechanisms for them to cross, which has led to a lot of an increased mortality rate and fatality rate amongst these refugees. And you can see that most of the refugees that die in the process of trying to get to a safer place actually die in the Mediterranean. But as we know from various thought traditions, it is our duty to basically provide asylum to people in need. And in the Laudatio Si, it was also mentioned that we need to really address the suffering of the excluded. And human rights law also says that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution, but we have completely failed in this duty of doing so. So also policymakers know that all the components for a solution are actually at hand. They already knew that in 2016, but we are not implementing what we know should be done. So to my 3 points, so we need more open borders, we need more softer borders. Some people say, well, we cannot have softer borders because it will be economically devastating. Well, if we go back to John Galbraith, who is one of the classical economists, he already pointed out in 1979 in his classic book, The Nature of Mass Poverty, that migration is one of the oldest forms of action against poverty. And he actually uses some very strong language saying that what is the perversity of the human soul that causes people to resist so obvious a good? So he actually advocated for more open borders and for migration, because it would alleviate poverty in the center country, and it actually is also economically beneficial for the host country as well. There's a lot of statistics that actually support that. This is just another slide that speaks to exactly this point, that open borders are advantageous for both both the migrant receiving as well as the migrant sending countries, in terms of economic growth, in terms of also addressing demographic issues. As we've heard from Christine Lee, we have an aging population in Japan, in the European Union, in the United States. A lot of the refugees or migrants are very young people who are trying to improve their lot in life. And actually, if we would have a more open policy, it would be beneficial again for these countries to deal with the demographic decline that they are experiencing. And by having more open borders, we would address some of the concerns also expressed by Pope Francis, such as he also pointed out that there is this inequality across countries in the global north and south. He also pointed out that we need to enable a demographic development compatible with shared development and the reduction of inequality. And as we know from Gilbreth, that basically, if we have more open borders, we would actually address this problem of inequality and establish more economic equality across borders. So there are also...
Christine, could you just come to your conclusion, please?
Okay, sure. I just want to point out there are some countries that have established a good policies, such as Germany in 2016 had some best practices, as well as Uganda has some model practices. As I pointed out as well before, it is important to work more across borders and have more transnational cooperation and institutionalize these transnational corporations in order to address these sorts of problems that are global problems, they're not national problems. Then lastly, we need to change the discourse about migration and point out that migration is actually a good thing. Instead of images that portray migrants as the dangerous other or the victimized, traumatized victim, we need to really emphasize the benefit migrants and refugees can bring to a potential host country. We need to basically tell these stories more effectively. And by doing so, hopefully we can, as Pope Francis said, basically he mentioned that human beings, whilst capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good and making a new start. And I think we are at a point in history where we do need a new start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine.